Hey everybody, today in our graphing series here at Rachel Robeson Educational Services, we're going to be taking a look at how to identify your variables and then use that information to appropriately give your graph a title and axis labels. Alright, so if we're taking a look over here at our data that we're given for this specific graph, we're going to use the data table to help us to construct our graph. Alright, so we have in the first section of the table age of trees in years. The second section, average thickness of annual rings in Forest A, measured in millimeters, and average thickness of annual rings in Forest B in millimeters. So first we need to decide from these three pieces of data here which we're going to have to use for our independent and dependent variables. So we have two over here that are very similar. Both of these are measuring the thickness of annual rings in a forest, but they're looking at two different forests, one called Forest A and one called Forest B. When you see two pieces of data that are, or two sections of data that are measuring the exact same thing, typically that's going to give you the clue that those are going to be not two different types of variables, okay? Because they're measuring the same thing, they are going to be two sets of data that need to show up separately on your graph. So that leaves us then with two possible variables, the age of tree in years and the average thickness of annual rings, okay? Because we're not looking specifically at the two forests as our variables, but rather we will be putting two sets of data, one for each forest, onto our graph. Okay, so next we need to decide if age of trees or average thickness of annual rings is our independent or our dependent variable. So if you remember from our intro video, the independent variable is the variable that the scientist or experimenter is changing on purpose. And our dependent variable is what they are measuring or observing in response to what they change. Okay. So age of trees in years and average thickness of rings in Forest A and Forest B. Those are our options here. So if we're looking for what the experimenter is purposefully changing, or our independent variable, it has to be the age of trees in years, because they are selecting specifically to look at the age of different trees, okay? Trees of different ages. That's what they've selected to compare to one another. And then they are going to measure or observe, based on the age of the tree, the thickness of the annual rings. So because they are measuring the thickness of the annual rings in response to the age of the tree, that is our dependent variable. Independent variable, dependent variable. Okay. So when you are using that information to help you with your graph, remember that the independent variable goes on the x, or the horizontal axis, and the dependent variable goes on the y, or the vertical axis. Okay, so down at the bottom here, because we know that we have our independent variable, we're going to go age of trees, and then we're going to put years in parentheses, because that's our unit, or what we are measuring the age of the trees in. It's important to do that so that the reader of the graph understands what measurements you're using. Then we're going to put our dependent variable over here, and we said that that was the average thickness of the rings, and we are measuring that in millimeters. We don't need to put forest A and forest B because we are going to include those two separate pieces of data later in a key. Okay, so we're going to have two sets of data on one graph, and we'll use a key to differentiate between those two. So we do not need to say of forest A and forest B over here because that will be understood later. All right, and then the last portion that we need to do here is to give our graph a scientific title. So when you're doing a scientific graph and you are, you know, trying to make it the best that you can be, and to make it an age-appropriate graph for the grade level that you're in, it's really no longer appropriate to, you know, you don't want to call this like Jim's awesome graph. Like that's has nothing to do with what you're trying to measure. And in basic graphing, they might have told you you could call this like tree rings and years of trees, or the age of trees and their rings. And while that's fine, it's really not technically correct. And so to get the most correct title for this type of graph, we're going to take y versus x. And that's going to be our title. Not literally y versus x, but what is on the y-axis versus what is on the x-axis. So the title of our graph here will be average thickness of rings versus, okay, so y versus what we have on x here, age of trees. Okay, and that gives you a simple way to always know what you should title your graph. Whatever is on the y versus whatever is on the x. All right, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below. We will continue putting this graph together in our next video in the series. So if you need information about how to construct an entire graph, watch this whole series. And if you just need pieces and parts, feel free to click on whatever it is you need help with. Please subscribe up at the top if you think that these videos are helpful. Thanks.